It was one of those crisp Boston mornings when the air feels clean enough to cut glass. Samantha sat in a small corner cafe, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the city move through fogged windows. She loved this place, the hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the faint smell of cinnamon drifting from the counter. It was her sanctuary from the chaos of the office. That's when Aaron walked in. He smiled, too warmly, and slid into the chair across from her without asking. He didn't even order, just leaned forward and said in a tone that carried a strange sweetness, "You must be so proud, getting all that attention while the rest of us are drowning." The words hit her like a sudden drop in temperature. On the surface, it was nothing more than a comment, harmless to an outsider, but Samantha felt the barb hidden inside. A compliment laced with poison. Something designed to sink into her thoughts and stay there for the rest of the day. And that's when it struck her. Toxic. People don't always come crashing into your life with open hostility. They don't need to shout or insult you outright. They only need to find a way inside your mind. They plant seeds of doubt. They spark guilt. They pull on invisible threads until you start unraveling from within. The most dangerous kind of attack is the one that makes you believe you need to defend yourself. This is the silent war we rarely talk about. A war fought in pauses between words, in the shift of a facial expression, in the weight of something left unsaid. It's not random, it's calculated. Toxic people study you. They learn what makes your voice change, what makes your chest tighten, what makes your hands shake just enough for them to know they've found your weak point. And once they have it, they use it like a musician playing a familiar chord, again and again, until you respond exactly how they want. They don't want truth, they want reaction. They want your focus pulled toward them so intensely that you forget your own center. They want you explaining, defending, proving, because every second you're explaining yourself, you're not living in your own power, you're dancing to their rhythm. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that we should be like the rock against which the waves crash, unmoved by the chaos around it. But what happens when the wave doesn't look like chaos at all? When it looks like concern, like humor, like casual conversation? That is the danger. The real threat is not the obvious storm. It's the quiet current you don't see until you're already drifting. Think about the last time someone left you replaying a conversation in your head. Maybe it was an offhand remark. Maybe it was a question that didn't need an answer. Yet, hours later, you were still thinking about what you should have said. That's not a coincidence. That's strategy. You were pulled into a script where they set the scene. They wrote your lines, and they controlled the ending. Samantha could feel the familiar urge rising. Explain, defend, prove you're not selfish, not arrogant, not someone who enjoys success, while others struggle. But that morning, she did something different. She took a slow sip of coffee, let the taste linger, and asked Aaron how his latest project was going. It wasn't just a deflection, it was a choice, a refusal to step into his arena. Because once you enter, you play by his rules. And the rules are designed so you cannot win. That single choice might seem small, but it was the first brick in a wall that would eventually protect her from years of mental erosion. It was her first act in a silent war she hadn't realized she was fighting. The truth is, toxic people rely on you not seeing the game. Once you recognize it, everything changes. Their comments lose weight. Their manipulation loses grip. You stop being the puppet because you can finally see the strings. And this is what this entire journey is about. Learning to see the strings before they pull you into movements you didn't choose. Learning to hold your ground in the calmest way possible. Learning to protect the most sacred space you have, your mind. If you've ever left a conversation feeling smaller, confused, or guilty without knowing why, you're in the right place. This series is going to hand you the tools the Stoics used to protect their peace. Even in the middle of political schemes, betrayals, and relentless criticism, Tools that still work today, in boardrooms, group chats, family dinners, and yes, quiet Boston cafes. So stay with me, because by the time we're done, you won't just understand this silent war. You'll know exactly how to win it without raising your voice, without defending your worth, and without sacrificing a single piece of your peace. If you believe these are lessons the world needs more of, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That small click tells me this message matters and gives me the drive to keep creating videos that bring you real strength, real clarity, and real change. And here's where I want to hear from you. Comment your answer below. Question: when someone makes a subtle, cutting remark toward you, what's your first instinct? A. Defend yourself and explain your side. B. Stay calm and redirect the conversation. Type A or B in the comments and tell me why. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Jordan had always been the kind of person who wore his emotions openly. In college, his friends teased him about how quickly his face would give away what he was feeling. If he was excited, you could see it in the way his eyes lit up. If he was frustrated, his voice would tighten before he even realized it. That openness made him likable in many ways, but it also made him predictable. And when he moved to Los Angeles to launch his startup, that predictability became a weakness others could exploit. It happened during a pitch meeting with an investor he had been chasing for months. Jordan had rehearsed his presentation for days, memorized every number, and even stayed up the night before refining his slides. He was ready, or so he thought. The investor sat across the table, flipping casually through Jordan's pitch deck, barely glancing at the slides. Then, without warning, he smirked and said, "Cute concept, but it's obvious you haven't really thought this through." The words landed like a gut punch. Jordan could feel the heat rising in his chest, his mind racing to prove the man wrong. Every instinct told him to defend his work, to explain how much research had gone into the plan, to argue point by point until the investor understood. In the past, he would have done exactly that. He would have let his emotions drive the conversation, desperate to win approval. But that day was different. Something in him paused. Instead of firing back, he took a slow breath and let the air fill his lungs. He felt the urge to react, but he didn't follow it. He leaned back slightly, steadying his tone, and said, "I hear your concerns. Let's take a look at the data." In that moment, the power shifted. Jordan was no longer chasing validation. He was leading the discussion. The investor's smirk faded just enough to show he had not expected that level of composure. Emotional non-reactivity is not about pretending you feel nothing. It is about refusing to let someone else's behavior decide your state of mind. Toxic people, difficult personalities, or even just those who thrive on control, rely on the predictability of your emotions. If they know which buttons to push to get you angry, defensive, or insecure, they can steer the conversation exactly where they want it. The Stoics understood this centuries ago. Epictetus wrote that if someone provokes you, it is because your mind has given consent to the provocation. That may sound harsh, but it is liberating when you realize it means you always have a choice. No one can make you react without your permission. At first, learning not to react can feel unnatural. You might feel cold, even guilty, as if you are withholding something. That discomfort is not a sign you are doing it wrong. It is a sign you are breaking the old patterns that kept you tangled in other people's emotions. Over time, you begin to see that calm is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of control. Training this skill takes practice. It begins with awareness. Notice the moments when you feel the impulse to respond immediately. In those moments, create a pause. It can be as small as a single breath before you speak. That pause is your chance to choose a response that serves you rather than serves the other person's agenda. Label the moment internally. If someone makes a sarcastic remark, quietly name it to yourself. That's bait. By naming it, You create space between the stimulus and your reaction. Ground yourself in your body. Pay attention to the feeling of your feet against the floor, the weight of your hands resting on your lap, the sound of your breathing. These physical anchors pull you out of your head, where emotions spiral, and into the present moment, where you can act with intention. Another powerful tool is the anchor phrase. It can be as simple as "not my storm" or "stay centered." Repeating it silently when you feel provoked reminds you that you do not need to enter the emotional space someone else is creating. Jordan began practicing what he called calm rehearsal. At home, he would imagine scenarios where someone might try to provoke him. He would practice holding a neutral expression, steady breath, and even tone while hearing those words in his head. It felt strange at first, but over time, his body learned that it did not have to flinch at every push. The result was not that he stopped feeling, it was that he stopped handing control of his emotions to anyone who wanted to take them. That meeting with the investor didn't lead to a deal, but it gave Jordan something more valuable in the long run, a reputation for being unshakable in the competitive, hyper-sure environment of the startup world. That reputation opened more doors than frantic arguments ever could. Emotional non-reactivity is not about winning every conversation. It is about winning yourself back. It is about creating enough space inside you that no one can throw you off center without your consent. When you master it, you are no longer living in reaction to the storms around you. You are the calm in the center, deciding where your energy goes and who gets to have it. And that calm, once you've built it, is something no manipulator, critic, or provoker can take away. Anthony had learned to work with noise his whole life. Growing up in New Orleans meant living in a city that thrived on music, conversation, and the constant rhythm of people moving. As a jazz musician, he was no stranger to loud bars, late-night rehearsals, and crowded streets. But there was another kind of noise that unsettled him far more than anything a trumpet could produce. It was the noise of subtle criticism, the kind slipped into a conversation under the disguise of humor or casualness, meant not to build connection, but to unsettle. It happened one evening during the family's annual holiday dinner. The table was full, plates stacked high with gumbo and cornbread. Anthony was relaxed, laughing with a cousin, when his uncle leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry across the table. "Guess we'll see you next year when you've finally made it big, or at least found a real job." The comment was followed by a chuckle, as if it were a harmless joke. But Anthony recognized it for what it was, a subtle dig, a quiet attempt to put him on the defensive. In the past, he might have laughed awkwardly and rushed to explain the shows he had booked, the money he had made, the progress he was making in his career. He would have tried to prove himself right there at the dinner table. This time, he didn't. He set the cornbread down, met his uncle's eyes for a brief moment, and then turned to continue his conversation with his cousin. No explanation, no return jab, no defensive posture, just silence. That silence was not born from avoidance. It was deliberate. It was the choice to deny entry to a game he hadn't agreed to play. He knew his uncle's remark wasn't seeking truth. It was seeking reaction. By saying nothing, Anthony didn't just refuse to engage, he refused to give away his emotional currency. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness or passivity. In reality, it can be one of the most powerful responses you have. Words can be twisted, tones can be misinterpreted, and emotions can be weaponized. Silence cannot be spun into something you didn't intend. It is clean. It is untouchable. Toxic or difficult people often rely on feedback to calibrate their tactics. When they see your expression change, hear the defensiveness in your tone, or notice your need to explain, they know their words have landed. That reaction feeds them. It gives them insight into where your boundaries are weakest. But when your face remains calm, when your tone is neutral, when your response is simply no response, they are left with nothing to measure. Silence can also be a mirror. For those who thrive on external chaos to avoid facing their own internal unrest, silence forces them into confrontation with themselves. Without your energy to latch onto, they are left with their own words echoing back at them. That's why silence can feel so threatening to people who depend on control. Using silence strategically takes practice. The first step is knowing when to stop talking. Not every accusation or misunderstanding requires your explanation. When someone distorts your intentions or tries to pull you into an argument, remember that engaging on their terms gives them the frame of the conversation. Declining to engage keeps the frame in your hands. The second step is letting silence stretch. In conversation, most people rush to fill gaps. Those gaps can be uncomfortable, but they are where power often lives. When you allow a moment of quiet to remain after a loaded comment, you signal that you are not rushed, not reactive, and not easily moved. Body language is essential here. Still posture, calm, breathing, steady eye contact when needed. Even if you choose to walk away, do so with clarity and without visible agitation. Exiting without a flinch sends a stronger message than any speech could. Anthony began to carry this practice into other areas of his life. When a fellow musician made a passive-aggressive remark about his playing, he didn't defend himself. When a promoter tried to pressure him into accepting an unfair deal, he let the offer sit in silence until the other man grew uncomfortable enough to fill the space with a better one. The more he used silence with intention, the more he realized its value. It was not about ignoring problems. It was about refusing to feed the wrong ones. Silence is not the absence of response, it is the presence of control. It is choosing not to give away what someone is trying to take. It is understanding that your peace is more important than winning a small exchange of words. Over time, it becomes less about what you are withholding from others and more about what you are preserving for yourself. That holiday dinner ended without incident. Anthony enjoyed his meal, his laughter, and the music that followed. His uncle's comment faded into nothing because Anthony never gave it life. And in that, he found something worth more than any comeback. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't have to prove yourself to anyone who has already decided not to see you clearly. When you begin to use silence strategically, you discover that you can walk away from provocation without carrying it with you. You can leave a conversation without replaying it over and over in your mind. You can hold your ground without saying a word. That is the strategic power of silence. It doesn't just protect you from toxic energy, it makes you invisible to it. Leah had built a reputation in Chicago for being the person everyone could count on. Friends knew they could call her at midnight with a crisis, and she would answer. Colleagues knew she would pick up extra work without complaint, even distant. Acquaintances knew that a text to Leah would almost always be answered within minutes. She told herself this was kindness, reliability, and loyalty. But what she didn't see at first was how that constant availability had become an open door for people to step into her life whenever they pleased, regardless of her needs or limits. After ending a long relationship, Leah began to notice the pattern more clearly. Her ex had learned her rhythms well. He knew when she was most likely to be alone and when she would be too tired to think clearly. That's when the late-night calls would come, marked urgent. Even though the conversations were nothing more than his attempts to pull her back into the same exhausting cycles. At first, she still picked up, still listened, still offered comfort she no longer owed. Each time, she felt drained, as if she had been pulled into an old room she had already locked for good reason. The turning point came one evening when she was about to step into a yoga class. Her phone lit up with his name, the word urgent, flashing in the preview. She felt the familiar tug of responsibility, the reflex to answer and make sure he was all right. But this time she didn't. She let it go to voicemail, silenced her phone, and walked into the warm studio light. When she checked later, the missed call was followed by a string of messages. The first was vague concern. The second dripped with accusation. "So you're ignoring me now?" In the past, she would have rushed to explain, telling him she was in class, apologizing for not answering, trying to smooth the tension. Instead, she typed 2 words, "Not available." She sent it without further detail and left it at that. Strategic unavailability is not about ignoring the people you care about. It is about recognizing that instant access is not a right anyone is entitled to. The more available you make yourself to everyone at all times, the more others begin to see your time and attention as something they can claim on demand. For those who wish to manipulate or control, that availability becomes a lever they can pull whenever they want to disrupt your focus, your mood, or your day. By limiting access, you shift the balance. Instead of reacting to other people's timelines, you begin operating on your own. You choose when and how to engage, which means you engage from a place of stability rather than urgency. This is not selfishness. It is stewardship of your own energy. Closely tied to this is the power of no explanation. For many people, the instinct to explain themselves runs deep. They feel that saying no without justification is rude, or that declining access without a reason is an invitation for conflict. But in unhealthy dynamics, explanations become tools for manipulation. When you give someone your reasons, you also give them material to argue with, twist, or dismantle. They can reframe your words, question your logic, or poke holes in your story until you are right back where you started, over-explaining, defending, and doubting yourself. There is a quiet strength in saying no, I'm not available, or that doesn't work for me, and letting those words stand alone. It closes the loop. It removes the opening for someone to pull you into a debate about your own boundaries. Leah found that the less she explained, the more she began to trust herself. She no longer needed to convince anyone that her limits were valid. They were valid because they were hers. That clarity made her presence feel different, both to herself and to others. People who respected her adjusted without question. People who didn't were faced with a reality. They could no longer bend. One way to strengthen this boundary is to treat your availability as something rare. Imagine it as a gemstone displayed only at certain times and in certain settings. When something is always on display, it becomes ordinary, expected, and eventually undervalued. But when it appears sparingly and intentionally, it draws respect and attention. Leah began setting quiet rules for herself. She decided on certain hours each evening when her phone would be in another room. She stopped checking messages during meals. She gave herself permission to wait until the next day to respond to anything that was not urgent. At first, the silence felt strange. She had built so much of her identity around being responsive that holding back felt unnatural. But with each day, the stillness began to feel like breathing room she hadn't realized she needed. The world did not fall apart when she became less reachable. The people who valued her adjusted to her new pace. The ones who had relied on her instant response to feed their own needs grew frustrated. And in that frustration, they revealed the imbalance she had tolerated for too long. Strategic unavailability and the refusal to over-explain work together as a shield. One limits the opportunities for someone to intrude on your peace. The other removes the hooks they can use to pull you back in. Together, they create space for you to move through life without constantly being pulled into the storms of others. Leah left that yoga class lighter than she had in years. Not because she had ignored her ex, but because she had finally chosen her own presence over someone else's demand. She didn't justify it. She didn't defend it. She simply lived it. And in doing so, she took another step toward a life where her time, her energy, and her peace were hers to give, not hers to lose. Daniel had always believed that the best way to resolve conflict was to talk things through. At work in Seattle, this meant he often found himself in the break room defending his decisions, explaining his reasoning, and reassuring others that he was doing his part. For a long time, he thought this was diplomacy. In reality, it made him predictable, and predictability was something his coworker Victor had learned to exploit. Victor had a talent for shifting blame. Whenever a project hit a snag, he would corner Daniel casually, coffee cup in hand, and deliver a line meant to provoke. "You always drop the ball. Management knows it, too." The words were delivered with just enough confidence to sound like fact, and Daniel's reflex was always the same: defend himself. Lay out the timeline, mention the parts he had completed. Sometimes, he even brought up Victor's own delays, and without fail, these exchanges left him drained and distracted. One Monday morning, the script began again. Victor's voice cut through the air with his usual line, expecting the usual result. But this time Daniel didn't defend himself. He didn't even answer. He took a slow sip of his coffee, met Victor's eyes briefly, and then turned away to place his mug in the sink. The silence was not hurried or uncomfortable. It was steady, unshaken. Victor lingered for a moment, perhaps waiting for the rebuttal that never came, before muttering something under his breath and walking out. Breaking predictability is about reclaiming your emotional playbook. Toxic people rely on patterns. If they know that guilt will make you apologize, they will use guilt. If they know that accusations will make you defend yourself, they will accuse. The more predictable you are, the more control they have over how interactions unfold. By removing the expected response, you force them into unfamiliar territory. Without the reaction they anticipate, they lose both momentum and control. This is not about becoming cold or detached from everyone. It is about becoming intentional with your responses so that no one can script your emotions for you. The first step is to observe your own habits. Pay attention to the triggers that set you off and the words or situations that make you respond automatically. These are the openings someone can exploit. Once you know your patterns, you can begin to interrupt them. Sometimes that means a pause before you answer, letting silence occupy the space where you once rushed to speak. Other times, it means changing your approach entirely, asking a question instead of defending yourself, or even walking away without comment. The goal is not to win an argument, but to remove yourself from the predictable rhythm that allows someone else to dictate your behavior. Closely tied to breaking predictability is the boundary of controlled exposure. Daniel realized that his vulnerability at work didn't just come from his willingness to defend himself. It also came from how much he shared. He had been open about his workload, his personal schedule, even small frustrations he was experiencing. On the surface, it seemed harmless. In the wrong hands, it became a tool for manipulation. Controlled exposure is about recognizing that not everyone should have access to every part of you. Just because someone asks does not mean they deserve an answer. Just because they listen does not mean they listen with good intentions. When you give away too much, too soon, you hand people the exact material they can use to undermine you. Daniel began thinking of his personal information in layers. The first layer was public safe, surface-level details anyone could know. The second was reserved for people who had proven themselves trustworthy over time. The third was his inner circle thoughts, fears, and ambitions he would only share with those who had earned their place there. To protect those layers, he started practicing what he called emotional encryption. When asked personal questions by people he didn't fully trust, he would give partial, non-specific answers. Not lies, just enough truth to maintain a friendly tone without revealing anything that could be turned against him. If someone asked about a deadline, he might say he was working steadily, rather than naming exact dates. If they asked about his weekend, he might share a light detail, without mentioning the private commitments that mattered most to him. This shift was not about becoming distant. It was about becoming selective. In the months that followed, Daniel noticed a change in how people interacted with him. Those who respected boundaries still engaged with him easily. Those who had once probed for information found fewer openings. And without those openings, their attempts at manipulation began to fade. Breaking predictability removes the script others try to hand you. Controlled exposure removes the ammunition they might use if the script fails. Together, they create a level of stability that is difficult to shake. You are no longer reacting on cue or offering the kind of access that makes manipulation easy. One afternoon, Victor made another attempt. You didn't update the client on Friday, did you? Instead of explaining the email he had sent or pointing out Victor's own oversight, Daniel simply replied, "The client has what they need." Then he turned back to his work. There was no defense, no extra detail, no invitation for debate. The conversation ended there, not because Victor agreed, but because there was nothing left for him to pull on. The most powerful position you can hold in any interaction is the one where you know more about your own patterns than anyone else does, and where you decide what parts of yourself are accessible to others. Daniel's change wasn't about becoming harder to know. It was about ensuring that the people who knew him had earned that privilege, and with that, the noise that had once surrounded him began to quiet, replaced by something far more valuable: space to move through his days without the constant weight of someone else's script. Olivia sat across from Carla at a small cafe in Miami, sunlight pouring through the wide windows and bouncing off the polished tables. They had known each other for years, but lately the friendship had begun to feel different. Carla leaned back in her chair, her tone dripping with accusation, as she said, "You've changed. You're not as available for me anymore. Guess you're too busy for real friends now." The words hung between them, carefully designed to sting, to pull Olivia into defending herself, into explaining that her life had been hectic, that she still cared, that nothing had really changed. For a brief moment, Olivia felt the familiar urge to do exactly that. The instinct to repair, to reassure, to prove her loyalty was strong, but she had been working on something new. She had learned that explaining herself to someone determined to misunderstand her was like pouring water into a broken glass. No matter how much you give, it will never stay. She let the urge pass. Then, with a calm voice and a steady gaze, she said, "I value calm. Let's talk about something uplifting." She picked up her fork and began eating again. Carla blinked, caught off guard. There was no argument to step into, no defensive opening to exploit. Olivia had redirected the moment without raising her voice, without matching accusation with accusation. The conversation shifted. The tension dissolved, not because Carla had suddenly changed her view, but because Olivia refused to feed the dynamic that had kept them circling the same conflicts. Redirection is a subtle but powerful boundary. It is not about ignoring reality or pretending an insult did not happen. It is about refusing to be drawn onto a playing field where you cannot win because the rules are designed against you. When someone tries to bait you into defending your worth, redirection turns the focus away from their narrative and back to what you are willing to engage with. It allows you to keep the frame of the conversation instead of handing it over. The key to making redirection work is clarity. You must know, before the moment arrives, what you are and are not willing to discuss. Without that clarity, it is too easy to be swept into defending yourself or explaining your boundaries in the heat of the moment. This is where the presence principle comes in. Your presence, the energy you bring into a room, is the unspoken boundary that others feel before you say a word. People calibrate to what you project. If your presence communicates calm self-respect, those who value you will meet you there. Those who don't will find themselves frustrated because the old ways of drawing you in no longer work. Olivia had started practicing this months before her meeting with Carla. She learned to pause before answering questions that carried emotional hooks. She created simple redirection phrases she could use without thinking. "That's not something I'm open to discussing." Or "Let's focus on what matters right now." Or "I hear you, but I'm choosing a different direction." These phrases acted like stepping stones, leading her out of the emotional traps others set and back onto solid ground. The presence principle goes beyond words. It is in your posture, your tone, your timing. It is in the way you can let silence stretch without scrambling to fill it. It is in the way you can exit a conversation without rushing or apologizing. This kind of presence does not have to be loud to be felt. In fact, its quietness is part of its strength. It leaves space for others to feel the weight of their own words and behavior without you carrying that weight for them. Living your boundaries is different from announcing them. Anyone can say they have limits, but it is your consistent action that teaches others how to treat you. If you tell people, you won't tolerate disrespect, but continue to explain yourself to someone who is dismissive, the boundary is only theoretical. When your actions match your words without contradiction, your boundaries become part of who you are, not just something you talk about. Olivia began doing what she called an energy audit once a week. She would sit down with her journal and list the interactions that had left her feeling drained, anxious, or resentful. Then she would ask herself what part of her boundary had been tested or broken in those moments. The next step was deciding how to respond differently the next time. Sometimes that meant creating a redirection phrase in advance. Other times it meant choosing not to participate in certain conversations at all. The more she practiced, the less she needed to announce her boundaries. Her presence carried them for her. One of the most powerful realizations Olivia had was that she didn't have to win arguments to protect herself. She didn't have to convince Carla or anyone else to see her the way she saw herself. Her worth was not up for negotiation. This freed her from the exhausting cycle of trying to change other people's perceptions. When she left the cafe that day, she didn't replay the conversation in her mind. She didn't feel the tightness in her chest that used to come from unresolved tension. Instead, she felt the lightness of knowing she had stood in her truth without the need to justify it. Redirection and presence are not about controlling others. They are about mastering yourself. They are about refusing to let someone else's chaos define your tone, your focus, or your inner state. And when you live this way consistently, you stop being the person who can be pulled into every argument or emotional spiral. You become the steady point in your own life, the one who decides where your energy goes and what it builds. That is the quiet power of living your boundaries. When you step back and look at the journey Samantha, Jordan, Anthony, Leah, Daniel, and Olivia have taken, a clear thread runs through every moment. Each of them began in a place where their emotions, time, and attention were wide open to the world. They were reachable at any hour, quick to defend themselves, eager to explain, and predictable in their reactions. They all had good intentions, kindness, professionalism, loyalty, but those same traits became entry points for manipulation and control. Samantha learned first that toxic dynamics rarely begin with loud, obvious attacks. They start quietly, with subtle remarks that leave you second-guessing yourself. She realized that the silent war isn't fought in shouting matches, but in those small, seemingly harmless exchanges that are designed to hook your emotions. From her, we saw that the first step is recognizing the game before you get pulled into it. Awareness became her shield. Jordan took that awareness and turned it into composure. Faced with someone who tried to provoke him into scrambling for approval, he chose calm over reaction. He understood that emotional non-reactivity isn't about feeling nothing, but about refusing to hand over control of your state of mind. In that choice, he broke the cycle of being led by someone else's emotional script. Anthony brought us the power of silence. In the past, he might have explained, defended, or even joked his way out of uncomfortable moments, but he discovered that strategic silence could hold more weight than any argument. It could remove the mirror that manipulative people use to reflect themselves through your reactions. His stillness became its own kind of statement, one that couldn't be twisted or used against him. Leah stepped into her own strength by becoming intentionally unavailable. She understood that instant access to her attention was not a right, and that explaining her absence only invited manipulation. By limiting when and how she engaged, and by removing the habit of over-explaining, She reclaimed time and mental space she hadn't realized she was losing. Her life began to move at her own pace again. Daniel showed us that breaking predictability and controlling what we share are essential to staying in control of our lives. He stopped giving the reactions people expected, and in doing so, disrupted the patterns they relied on. He also learned that not everyone deserves the same level of access to his personal thoughts, struggles, and plans. By sharing selectively, he removed the ammunition that could be used against him. Olivia closed the circle with the principle of redirection and the presence that comes from living your boundaries. She stopped defending herself, two people determined to misunderstand her. Instead, she calmly guided conversations away from emotional traps and let her consistent actions speak louder than explanations. Her boundaries stopped being words and became part of who she was. Taken together, their stories are not about shutting the world out or becoming indifferent. They are about building a life where your peace, time, and emotional energy are protected by design, not by chance. They are about recognizing that every reaction, every explanation, every piece of access you give is a choice and that you have the power to choose differently. The deeper lesson here is that boundaries are not just what you say no to. They are the way you live every day. They are in the pauses you take before responding, in the conversations you don't attend, in the silence you allow to speak for you, in the rare moments you choose to share your inner world. Boundaries are not walls meant to keep everyone out. They are the structure that keeps you standing strong, so you can choose who and what is worth letting in. Applying this to your own life begins with awareness. Notice where your emotional reflexes are strongest. When do you feel the urge to defend yourself? Who gets immediate access to you? And how do you feel after those interactions? Where are you the most predictable in your responses? These are the areas where you are most vulnerable to manipulation or emotional drain. Next, choose one boundary to strengthen. It might be delaying your responses, practicing silence in triggering moments, or deciding not to explain your decisions to people who don't respect them. Start small and be consistent. Over time, these small changes build into an unshakable foundation. Finally, remember that your worth is not proven through arguments won or explanations accepted. It is proven by how you live in alignment with your values, regardless of who approves. The more you embody your boundaries, the less you have to announce them. People will adjust to the presence you carry, and those who cannot will naturally drift away, leaving space for relationships that are built on mutual respect. So here's my question to you. After hearing this journey, which of these boundaries do you feel is the hardest to hold in your own life? Is it staying calm instead of reacting, practicing silence, becoming less available, breaking predictability, controlling what you share, or redirecting conversations? Comment your answer below so others can learn from your perspective and see they're not alone in facing these challenges. And if you found this story valuable, if it sparked something in you or gave you a tool you didn't have before, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That simple action tells me this is worth continuing and gives me the motivation to keep creating content that helps you build a stronger, calmer, and more unshakable life.